Meeting is being broadcast online and throughout Parliament buildings, and so we would welcome anyone watching online. So if mobile phones can be muted and no recording or photography of the meeting is allowed. So if members are content, we will proceed with the agenda. So members, we have apologies from Claire Sugden, and I think everyone else is present. Members, we've added another item to the agenda, and that is a declaration of interest, and I would ask if any members have any interest to declare. No? Okay, thank you. Okay, so chairperson's business. Members, I think we were all present last week at the session on the historical institutional abuse, and so we welcome the report from Barnardo's and the Good Shepherd sisters, who have indicated they're prepared to make an interim payment in relation to the historical institutional child abuse, and I sincerely hope that's forthcoming shortly. As you know, we are going to invite the Executive Office to a future meeting along with the institutions to find out what is happening in that space, but for now I think it's a positive move from those two institutions that they have indicated their willingness. Members, draft minutes then, these are found in your meeting pack pages 8 to 11, and I would ask if people are content that they're a true reflection of the proceedings. Okay, I'll go ahead and sign them. Okay, so matters arising then. So members, on page 13 of your meeting pack, there's correspondence from Jerry McCann of the Rosetta Trust thanking us for last week's evidence session. And page 14 of the meeting pack, is a letter from the spokespersons for the St Patrick survivors, stating that over 1,000 survivors have not been successful or have withdrawn themselves from the process of redress. So the Redress Board data from 31st of December 2023 states that there were 4,637 applications considered, 711 received no award, and 298 were withdrawn. So, as I say, we will continue to come back to this issue. So, members, you'll recall, because the session was so long last week, that we deferred agreement on a number of actions, so I'll come back to those now. On pages 15 and 16 of your meeting pack, there's a clerk's brief summarising the potential actions arising from last week's meeting. Quite a lot, and I thank the clerk and his staff for going back over the session and pulling those out. So if people are content, we'll proceed with those letters to the various bodies. So members, I would seek your agreement on whether we want to hear from the department and the service delivery agencies, WAVE and Victims and Survivors Service, before calling the institutions before the committee. So that's really to give them a right of response to some of the issues that were raised, or whether we want to go ahead and invite the institutions at the earliest opportunity.
Both.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I think that the TO officials have to be in there as well in terms of their work on this. Okay, thank you, members. Okay, so again, there was some deferred action then in the correspondence from last week, and on pages 17 and 18 of your meeting pack, we'll go through those. Now, was there anything in particular, Clerk, that you want to draw out from the other actions?
No, just the ones in the brief there. The specific ones were, sorry, I'll just pick that up. Yeah.
Don't worry, we'll come back on them. Okay, members, not to delay any longer then. So we'll go forward with our first session. So we have the Chief Commissioners of the Equality Commission and of the Human Rights Commission. They're going to give oral evidence. So we have Alison Kilpatrick, who's the Chief Commissioner for the Human Rights Commission. We have Geraldine McGahey, from the Chief Commissioner from the Equality Commission. We have Ailish Hockey, who's the Director of Human Rights after EU withdrawal within the Human Rights Commission, and Roisin Mallon, who's Director for the Dedicated Mechanism Unit within the Equality Commission. So thank you and welcome, ladies, a full panel of ladies today. So I'm not sure how you want to proceed. Who's going to lead first?
I'm going to go first, if that's okay, followed by Alison.
Lovely, thank you,
and then the two ladies on either side, who are directors in our respective organisations with responsibility for the dedicated mechanism, will help us answer your questions. Okay. So first of all, as the Chair has said, I'm Geraldine McGahey. I'm the Chief Commissioner of the Equality Commission. And on behalf of all of us, thank you for the invitation to be here before you today to brief you on our Article 2 commitments, or on the Article 2 commitment of the Windsor Framework. First of all, we're going to do this in two parts. I'm going to speak about the Article 2 commitment itself and what it means, and outline the role of our two organisations as a dedicated mechanism. And then Ali will focus on any key legal developments on Article 2 and other issues of concern. So, as co-signatory and guarantor of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, the UK Government committed in Article 2 of the Windsor Framework to protect rights, safeguards and equality of opportunity provisions as set out in that agreement, and that these would not be reduced following Brexit. The relevant rights in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which are underpinned by EU law, are set out in Annex 1 of the framework. And these equality directives relate to the protection against discrimination and promotion of equality of opportunity on the grounds of gender, race, disability, religion or belief, age and sexual orientation. However, there are other EU laws in addition to those in the Annex that engage Article 2, and our working paper, which provides information on the scope of Article 2, is linked in the briefing document that you received, so you can have a look at it there. But I have to say this work provides greater clarity on Article 2 generally, and its value has already been recognised by our courts. Ali will talk much more about those later. The Commissions, as a dedicated mechanism, have been given powers and responsibilities to ensure that the UK Government meets its Article 2 commitments. This role includes monitoring, supervising and enforcing the implementation of the commitment, providing advice to government on legislation and policy, undertaking research, and more importantly, providing legal advice and assistance to individuals and raising awareness generally. Significantly, the UK Government has made the commitment to ensuring that Northern Ireland law will keep pace with any future changes that the EU may make to the EU equality law set out in Annex 1, including keeping pace in relation to the EU Court of Justice case law in this area. We have already identified that some of the forthcoming EU law that will fall within the scope of this keeping pace commitment, and this includes the EU directives on binding standards for equality bodies and the EU Pay Transparency Directive. I think you should note that the commitment is important to people here in Northern Ireland. Our latest public awareness survey shows that 3/4 of respondents indicated that the government's commitment to protecting these equality and human rights protections after Brexit was important to them. But worryingly, over half of all respondents, that was 53%, were concerned that their equality and human rights had already been reduced due to Brexit. The Northern Ireland Executive and the Assembly cannot act in a way that is incompatible with Article 2. Consideration of Article 2 compliance at the earliest stage of policy and legislative development is vital for the effective implementation of Article 2. Therefore, this committee has a really important and vital scrutiny role. As the committee takes forward its scrutiny work on draft legislation and key strategies, we ask that it gives detailed consideration as regards their compliance with Windsor Framework Article 2. The Executive Office itself has a leadership role to play in this regard. Article 2 needs to be systemically embedded into the legislative and policy making processes of Northern Ireland departments. I want to record that we welcome the work that the Executive Office has already undertaken in this area in providing awareness raising and guidance and training for officials across the civil service. It's important that this work is continued and built upon, and we would recommend that the committee maintain active oversight of this important work undertaken by the Executive Office. The storm and break mechanism has been introduced to further address the democratic deficit. It gives MLAs, in certain circumstances, the power to object to the application of amended EU laws. However, this mechanism applies to goods and trade and does not apply to the keeping pace commitment under Article 2. But however, we would want to stress that we still need to be vigilant. because there may be unintended consequence which would impact on equality and human rights in Northern Ireland. And an example of that would be the EU Accessibility Act that impacts on accessibility standards for disabled people. It is important, therefore, that equality and human rights considerations are built into all key stages of the storm and break mechanism. And the Windsor Framework Democratic Scrutiny Committee should engage with the Commissions and other stakeholders to seek their views on these matters. We have been working to provide expert advice to government, and our most recent annual report, published last July, makes clear that there are significant and evolving risks to equality and human rights post-Brexit. We have set out in detail what we consider needs to be done to address these. We look forward to a response to our recommendations from the UK Government and from the Executive Office. We have also commissioned independent research, which provides an important evidential baseline to move forward with. We have recently published research on the impact of Brexit on minority, ethnic and migrant people, the impact of Brexit on women, and the impact of the loss of EU funding. We have developed a series of policy recommendations arising from this research to secure meaningful changes for equality groups here. There is also an all-island dimension to our work as well. We work with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission regarding rights and equality issues within the scope of Article 2 that have an Island of Ireland dimension. And this is because the Belfast Good Friday Agreement sets out a very broad expectation that there will be equivalence of rights and protections across the island. There are already gaps in equality and rights provisions in Northern Ireland, as you probably are well aware, including issues such as age GFS, race and disability law reform, and gender pay reporting. Northern Ireland is increasingly falling behind the level of protection that's afforded to citizens across the rest of the UK and in Ireland. And to align with best practice and to strengthen rights and protections, and at the same time avoid an increasing divergence of rights, we are calling on the Northern Ireland Executive to voluntarily align with changes to EU laws where these actually strengthen the protections and do reflect best practice. We have worked with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission to develop research and policy recommendations in this area. The Executive Office has a really important role to play in addressing these gaps. This role includes promoting equality and social inclusion through the adoption of new equality legislation, or indeed encouraging other departments to address gaps in equality legislation. And we would ask that the committee maintain active oversight over this important work by the Executive Office. In conclusion, the UK Government's commitment in Windsor Framework Article 2 is important, and it's really relevant in terms of the scrutiny work of this committee going forward. Finally, I just want to reassure you, the Commissions take these powers and responsibilities very seriously, and we will continue to work together to robustly hold the UK Government to its Article 2 commitment. And I will now pass to Alison.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I'd also like to thank you for inviting us. We very much appreciate the opportunity to come here and discuss our work, but also to hear what interests you and what concerns you. If there is anything, I suspect there is. And if I could, I'd like to begin by echoing some of the points made by Geraldine already. Windsor Framework Article 2 is an important, but it's a limited protection, and it's against slippage against human rights and equality standards to which the UK was already committed. It was designed to endorse, provide a degree of stability and reassurance at a time of upheaval and consternation, and we haven't passed that period yet. And that's particularly helpful, we would say, if the discourse over rights is contentious, and sadly they still are, and when standards, as Geraldine has alluded to, and I think we'll probably say a little bit more later, lag behind those in neighbouring jurisdictions. We welcomed this agreement, the Windsor Framework, and remain very encouraged by it. It is, however, novel and complex provision, and it has required and continues to demand significant analysis. And I'm delighted to say we have two of the best people I can think of helping us with that. Without that intense analysis, we couldn't have begun to clarify what this really means, and we certainly couldn't be helping policymakers and legislators, which is probably one of our main concerns. So before highlighting some recent developments, if I could just make the point in case it's lost, that the Windsor Framework is not a substitute for a Bill of Rights. It serves a very different purpose and falls short of what was contemplated for a Bill of Rights. So on legal and policy developments, we, as in, and when I say we, I mean both of our commissions throughout, been really busy ever since Article 2 was introduced. And first and foremost, we had to map the parameters of Article 2. We needed to know what we were dealing with, what it could achieve, its scope and its limitations. And this is, I found it really difficult, challenging to apply because, and Ailish does this, and Roisin both do this with a degree of dexterity that I don't have, but you have to have in your mind and read across several different texts. You then have to apply those in specific contexts and in particular factual scenarios, and it's not easy. So we've used our resources to try and achieve that clarity and expertise in-house, obviously. We have been assisted by roundtable discussions with experts, a range of relevant experts, and we've commissioned academic research and independent expert legal opinion, which has been really useful. In December 22, we published our first working paper on the scope of Article 2, and I believe that has stood us in really good stead ever since. It's a very robust but measured view of the nature and extent of the no diminution commitment, and it really helped us focus the rest of our work. And in that paper, it was recognised that various aspects would require clarification by the courts. So that's what we've been doing in the last 2 years, and the courts are really, judgments are starting to come through. And two of the key questions on judicial interpretation were, firstly, the personal scope of Article 2. In other words, to whom is the protection owed, and how do they enjoy that protection? And secondly, the scope of the rights covered by Article 2, given that they must derive from the relevant chapter of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And everyone in this room knows is they were deliberately vague in their description. And once you answer those questions, you have to determine then the scope of the European Union law that continues to set the minimum standards below which the law in Northern Ireland cannot fall. And we've been undertaking research ever since, and I think each piece of research has ended up being at least 100 pages. It's very complex and involved, but we're getting there. I think we know where we're going. I think we know what the courts are going to do. So just to give you a brief overview of what some of the courts have said so far. But to make the point, I think, a little bit self-congratulatory, but they have confirmed reassuringly key elements of our analysis from the outset and in that 2022 paper. There are, some of those cases are subject to appeal, and there are more in the pipeline, so we can't be too complacent about it. But I'll start with the May 2023 appeal, which was by the Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child, SPUC. And in that case, the court adopted a 6-point test, which is, I think it's pretty much the same as ours. Ours was 5 points, but in substance, it's pretty much the same. Certainly very similar to that set out by us. And what the Court of Appeal said in that case was that it had drawn particular assistance from both Commission's written submissions and from the Commission's working paper, and that was enormously pleasing because it told us that all the work we put into it was really fruitful. In October 23, the High Court held that asylum seekers and refugees are within the personal scope of Article 2, and that was the Anderson case, which some of you may have looked at already. Both commissions intervened in that case, and why that was so important was it made it clear that it wasn't dependent on status. So it was all people in Northern Ireland, all people who happened to be in Northern Ireland. The court identified certain measures of EU asylum law which bound the UK prior to Brexit and held that they continue to set minimum standards in Northern Ireland. The judgment also confirmed the continuing relevance of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and that might be something for a later session to get into more of the detail of it. The court rejected the suggestion that the rights in the relevant chapter of the agreement were frozen in time or limited to the political context of 1998. And that was really important so that we knew again what we were, the range of rights that we were talking about. And it wasn't limited simply to those people who'd been affected by a conflict. Most recently, the High Court considered this again in Dillon, which was the judicial review of the Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Act, in which both commissions intervened. And I'm sure, because we haven't been quiet about it, members will know that the Human Rights Commission has been very concerned, grave concerns about the Article 2 ECHR compliance of the Legacy Act and its lawfulness under the Human Rights Act. We have advised that it fails to comply with the European Convention on Human Rights, and it is simply not capable of being made compliant. For today's purposes, though, I will focus on, if I may, the application of Windsor Framework Article 2 to the Legacy Act. And consistent again with our analysis, the court adopted what it described as a generous and purposive approach to interpreting Windsor Framework Article 2. In other words, read it as if it was in the spirit in which it was intended, essentially. And referring to the commitment to civil rights in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, it said, a narrow definition of civil rights would undermine aspects of Article 2, Windsor Framework Article 2, and held that fundamental rights of victims are encompassed with the notion of civil rights. Again, that sort of clarity was really important. Those rights include, obviously, the court held the right to life, the right to be free from torture, cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment, the right to access a court, amongst other things. The court also held that if domestic legislation is found to be in breach of Windsor Framework Article 2, that law should be disapplied. And this question about remedy for breach was, we always thought it should be disapplied because that comes as a direct result of Article 4 of the UK-EU Withdrawal Agreement, which is an international treaty. And the UK undertook to ensure that domestic courts would set aside domestic legal provisions if they were incompatible with that treaty. So while there will be an argument on appeal about disapplication, we don't see that there is any other way of interpreting that other than using the express words, which were disapplication. So before I, and I should add that the Parliament, UK Parliament, democratically gave effect to that commitment by incorporating the entire treaty into domestic law in the EU Withdrawal Act, and that's Section 7A if you're interested. So before I finish, I'm conscious of time. Mention an ongoing case, if I may, which is also one which is going to really look at some of these issues. It's the Illegal Migration Act 2023. Now, the Human Rights Commission advised the UK of its opinion that there were numerous breaches of human rights standards at the heart of the Illegal Migration Act. That advice was not accepted, so we have used our power to bring a challenge in our own name. And as Geraldine says, we do that very sparingly, only as a measure of last resort. And our challenge covers a range of grounds, but includes our contention that it is in breach of Article 2 of the Windsor Framework. And that's because it reduces rights below the minimum standards required by the EU asylum directives, which bound the UK before Brexit and which are within the scope of Article 2. And again, until we're proven wrong, we think that's a very clear interpretation. The case was heard in January and we're waiting for judgment. I think we're expecting it quite soon. So thought we might have it by now. So let me finish with a few just very short, more general remarks about where we are. Courts helpfully setting the parameters, but we know there's a lot more to be decided, and we are intent on playing our part in that and assisting the court and challenging where necessary. We will continue to inform the discourse, both of us together and separately, and not least through our research programmes. And I think possibly the greatest challenge, and if I leave you with this, is that like any major change initiative, Article 2 requires a complete rewiring of policy and legislation, making procedures as well as sustained leadership. And one of the problems we've identified is simply an oversight that it's there, and we're all getting used to it, and that's understandable. So we would respectfully encourage this committee to make regular inquiries about systemic change as well as requesting detail of Article 2 consideration as part of your scrutiny rule. I have to say, although we have a slightly strange setup in that we're accountable to Westminster, but obviously we work for the benefit of Northern Ireland, and we consider it a great privilege to be back before you in this evidence session. Many of the issues which we've been working on are devolved and therefore very directly relevant to this committee, but also matters that aren't devolved will touch upon all the areas in which we are engaged. We're very grateful, if we can say, to the officials in the Executive Office who've assisted in the development of the treaty monitoring group, and I think that's going to be really useful for everyone involved. We're delighted as well, sorry if I'm appearing sycophantic, but we're delighted that you are putting meaningful consideration of human rights at the heart of policy and legislation making, and that's certainly what we would say Article 2 requires you to do, and we'll keep a lookout to make sure that everyone is. So we would look forward, I think, to returning to the committee, maybe in more detail, if you were to indicate to us what you are particularly interested in or what you're concerned with. We can answer anything in writing as well after this event. And just say thank you very much for hearing us, and so quickly after you've resumed your duties. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. Anything from... Okay, not for now. Okay, well, thanks very
We're here
much.
to answer the really difficult questions.
Yes.
Make us look better.
Yeah.
Thank you for submitting the briefings in advance. They're always very helpful. So I'll maybe start then and come to you, Geraldine, in terms of that sort of keeping pace part of your contribution there, in terms of where we've fallen behind the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain. Would you like to elaborate a little bit more on that, in terms of what we as an Assembly executive could be doing to actually bring things up?
If you cast your mind back to 1998, and I'm looking around the table, there are probably some who weren't even there then, but the reality is we might well have been ahead of Ireland in terms of the equality provisions that we had in our legislation. But as equality rights and protections have become a devolved matter for the Assembly, nothing really has changed except on foot of EU directives and EU law. So we view this keeping pace commitment to be really, really important. Across the UK, Northern Ireland lags behind on a number of different equality provisions, and that would be in terms of there is no protection against discrimination on the basis of your age. We have a legislative deficit really in terms of race relations and disability. We have no gender pay reporting, the gap reporting, as they would have in GB. And while that might have been contained within the Employment Act from 2016, that particular article was never enacted. So we're starting from behind the curveball, and we view this keeping pace commitment that the government has made as really, really important to Northern Ireland as a whole. How we deal with it is we work very closely with EU, with the NIO, etc., to keep an eye out for proposed amendments to the legislation, and then issue guidance and lobby and advocate to government. Those kind of introductions need to be addressed here in Northern Ireland. They don't always accept our recommendations, but as Alison said and I've said, we strategically choose the cases that we're going to take forward based on their importance. But there are a couple I mentioned, the EU directives for binding directives for equality bodies and the EU Pay Transparency Directive that we believe are the first two that are coming down the tracks that really need to be addressed so that we do keep pace, because it's a fundamental requirement, unless you want to add anything else.
Yes, as Geraldine said, there is an obligation on the UK government to dynamically align with EU changes to the Annex 1 Equality Directive. So they actually must do that. It's a legal requirement that they keep pace with any changes by the EU to those Annex 1 Equality Directives. And Geraldine's mentioned two examples where the Commission has now very clearly put forward that the UK government must align. That relates to the proposed directives on binding standards for equality bodies, which we understand will likely to shortly be passed by the European Commission and Parliament. And the other one is the Pay Transparency Directive, which has already been passed, is due to be transposed in 2026 by Member States. And our advice to government has been that Northern Ireland should align with that directive and put the Pay Transparency Directive into Northern Ireland by that date. The other element, just to elaborate on what Geraldine has said, relates to voluntary alignment. So that's when the UK government is not required to, but we say it would be good practice to strengthen rights here as a result of emerging EU law. So examples of that would be the Work-Life Balance Directive, for example, which has not totally been reflected in Northern Ireland domestic law to date. And another really important example is the EU Accessibility Act. So that act has already been passed. It's due to be transposed by, I think it's 2025. So that means that's about increasing accessibility in terms of products and services for older people and disabled people. So it'll make a huge difference. That will have to be put into place in Ireland. In fact, Ireland's already taken steps to bring that into force. but we're not aware of any plans across the UK to introduce that legislation here. So there's significant implications for older people, disabled people, if those similar requirements aren't transposed into Northern Ireland law.
Thank you. Just a follow-up, and I'll come to Alison. So it sounds like there's a lot of work from Brexit. What is happening in terms of the resources and the support you're receiving from the Executive Office?
There's close working relationship with the Executive Office, and we're indebted to the officials there for the cooperation that they have given to both the Equality Commission and the Human Rights Commission. But the resources that are supplied to both of our organisations actually come through from Treasury, and NIO manage those, the Executive Office here manage those on behalf of us as our sponsor department, whereas NIO would deal directly with the Human Rights Commission. Now, I have to say they are adequate at the moment, but we submit a business case for our resources on a 2-year programme, and we would hope that that level of commitment would be sustained, because without it, there's a lot of work that needs to be done that we couldn't do. Our resources with the Equality Commission have been cut by about 28-30% over the past number of years. And there's a lot of work that we should be doing that we simply cannot do because of the resources. So we will be keeping pressure on Treasury to make sure that those resources are maintained. But we would welcome the support of this committee in future if we should need it.
Thank you. Alison, just one for you then, in terms of, you mentioned there around the Bill of Rights. I'm just wondered, I know you came whenever Emma was chairing the ad hoc committee. I'm just wondering if you could maybe elaborate a wee bit more in terms of how you feel that we as an Assembly should maybe pick that issue up again.
I think the danger with the Windsor framework is that people thought we now had the additional protection because we had something here that we didn't have in GB, for example. That's not how it works. So there is additional protection here because there are particular circumstances. But the additional protection only relates to those things that couldn't have happened if we were still in the EU. The Bill of Rights would be very specific to those additional things that Northern Ireland has needed because of the conflict, but not necessarily related just to that. And as we can see from how the courts interpreted the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, wasn't just about conflict issues. It was about how to make sure we never went back to a conflict by securing the rights for everyone in the territory. So we don't see that as any substitution. And in any event, the Windsor framework would be very limited. So there would be lots of rights which wouldn't come within Windsor Framework Article 2 because they wouldn't be enshrined in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And those are precisely those things that the Bill of Rights was supposed to cure. So we would definitely encourage it to be taken up again, and if a further conversation needs to be had about the content of the Bill of Rights or further explanation about how it works or what people's concerns are, we're happy to do that.
Conscious of time, I'm going to go to our Deputy Chair, Connie, please.
Thank you everybody for coming in today. I just kind of wanted to ask if you could elaborate a bit more. You talked around there's various areas where you feel there has been divergence when it comes to equality and human rights, but you also mentioned when it comes to cases that you take in your own name that you don't do that lightly. I was wondering if you could just explain a bit further about what kind of considerations go into that before you consider to take a case.
When we're taking a case, we have a remit to provide legal assistance and advice to individuals who want to assert their rights. But more importantly, where we seek to intervene in legal action, we consider the significance of the item and the extent to which failure to intervene would potentially lead to a breach of those commitments that the government has already made. We have limited resources, so we try to use our resources to the maximum potential. And I think in the cases that we have intervened in so far, we have been very clear that it's within the scope of our own remit as an Equality Commission or as a Human Rights Commission. And you'll note from the Illegal Migration Act in terms of the intervention by the Human Rights Commission, that is within their bread and butter issues. So whilst we might support them, we're not part of that intervention process. We're monitoring it and giving advice and trying to make sure that where we can contribute, we do. In the likes of the Legacy Act, it is of such import to Northern Ireland as a whole that and the costs of it are likely to be quite high. We fully expect that it will go to the Supreme Court. And by both commissions intervening on separate issues, It has provided a way of making sure that our resources are spread a little bit better and that it's not all coming from one pot. But again, it's down to the significance of the breach. This is new, novel legislation, and it's about ensuring that we support the courts in terms of the information that we can provide to them based on our remit and the research that we've carried out to date, to ensure there's a consistent interpretation of it. Because at the end of the day, a decision as to whether or not there has been a breach can only be made by the courts. And we're at the very early stages where we're trying to make sure that there is clear interpretation and case law becomes embedded in not just our work, but all of the government departments.
Do you want me to add to the
own
name
please do.
case? Because I think we're the only ones who've done it, certainly in the last few years. We have a set criteria by which we judge issues and how we deal with those issues. Some are presented by, in a similar way to EC&I, to people presenting themselves with an issue. Others are identified by us because we have an ongoing duty to monitor, review, advise, etc. We would always prefer to advise and to assist and be constructive. Sometimes our advice isn't taken or it's not taken in a constructive manner. Sometimes we have to then enforce our powers, which were given to us very expressly. And in fact, the legislation was amended quite recently to make sure that we could have independence in bringing cases in our own name, and the significance of that was not overestimated. We also have to consider, obviously, whether we can add something to it, so we don't go in just because we could. Usually we will intervene in a case if it's already being brought, but sometimes that's fraught with difficulty, and it's much better to bring a case in our own name, but we do that. It is very rare, but we do it when we have to. So the Illegal Migration Act is one of them.
Thank you. I think that was a positive step forward to intervene in that act. So yeah, thank you, Chair.
Okay, Emma, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to you all for that presentation and for the paper that you provided prior to the meeting. I found that helpful. Firstly, I would like to associate myself with your remarks in relation to the Bill of Rights and concur with the Chair's question around that. Obviously, herself, myself and Carol sat in that committee and were involved in that work, and it's something that we would like to see. I believe the bulk of the work there is done, and we would like to see that progressed, and obviously it's an outstanding commitment from 1988. I suppose my question to you, and I probably should declare an interest here as I'm the only member of this committee who also sits in the Windsor Framework Committee, but some of the concerns that you've outlined in the paper and verbally today around the risks of the Stormont break impinging on minority communities within the north by basically blocking them from being able to access rights that are implemented through the EU going forward, and that's a concern that I have myself, and sitting on that committee, it's something that I have thought about a lot. And one of the examples that comes to mind is one of the things that, and it has been discussed in the public around the issue of mercury and amalgam, and this is an issue that is potentially going to raise its head, and something that we're potentially going to be doing an inquiry into around, the EU's ban of that, which has been, I suppose, a concern for local dentists because of the cost implication of it. A group of people who are in dire straits because of Tory austerity for the past 13 years, and that's the reason why the industry is in the place that it's in. But the implications of that for the general population in terms of the health risks associated with that. So that's something that I believe should be a focus, as opposed to just the optics that the Stormont break is really about. So I would appreciate your thoughts on that, and if that's something that you have looked at. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, and I know you've specifically made reference to your role as the no diminution level relating to Brexit, but one of the things that always strikes me when we left the EU, a massive thing that we have lost are our funds, and particularly as a rural rep that I talk about all the time, in rural areas, the loss of RDP, of single farm payment, has real life implications for people, and particularly for disproportionate impact on women, disproportionate impact on minority communities, particularly in rural areas, who were always the first to benefit from a lot of these schemes. And I'm thinking of community groups and nurseries and all of the other centres in rural areas who were able to benefit from that funding and have not had any opportunity to avail of any replacement. So I wonder if that's something that you're looking at, if you could give me your thoughts.
I'll just start on this, if I may. In terms of the loss of EU funding, we did have research undertaken on this very issue, and that involved consultation and engagement with a whole range of stakeholders, looking at what funding they had been getting from EU sources and how that was going to be supplemented. We made a number of recommendations on foot of that, but regardless of all of that, the outcome has been that you are right. There are many, many groups, from women's groups, disability sector, farming communities, all have suffered as a result of it. And if the truth be known, there are some programmes in Northern Ireland over many, many years where the funding was drawn down through these programmes, whereas the funding might have been provided for similar types of projects through local government across in GB. We are the only jurisdiction where the allocation of that funding is not being delivered locally, but rather through a Westminster group. And we have called on the Secretary of State on 2 or potentially 3 occasions to ensure that the Department of Communities and Housing and Levelling Up are actually designated under Section 75 so that they can demonstrate that they apply the equality principle to their decision-making processes. The Northern Ireland Act requires that any public authority delivering services in Northern Ireland should be designated, and we still haven't got to the bottom of that. I think the way in which the funding was delivered has been regrettable in terms of the lateness and the impact that it had on organisations. And many of those organisations are still finding themselves in a position where they're having to curtail their services or indeed plan to make further staff redundant. So it's an ongoing issue. We have a research paper that made a number of recommendations, and they're still very much live, and you'll find those as well within our annual report. On the issue of the storm and break, I give you an example, and Roisin referred to it as well, and that was the Accessibility Act. While it may initially and primarily deal with the manufacturing of lifts and disability access to those, and access for older people, the issue is that whilst the Windsor framework, the Democratic Scrutiny Committee have a role where they can apply the storm and break, they need to be able to demonstrate that they have adequately considered it, because the UK government, in receipt of such a notice, will ask and monitor that you have actually considered all of the issues and sought the appropriate advices. So that is why we've recommended that there should be an ongoing engagement with equality stakeholders and human rights stakeholders, because there is always the potential for a consequence that wasn't foreseen.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything else?
Maybe, and then I'm going to let Ailish show how smart she is in relation to that very complicated specific question. So the Annex 1 equality directives are excluded from the storm break, so that's okay in relation to changes, but what we have identified is that it's unlikely that additions, so if there's new equality provisions, they will be subject to the cross-community, I think it's called an applicability motion, isn't it? Yeah. And that is going to impede, I think, further down the line, new equality human rights directives. But the storm and break also applies to the bit that we sometimes dismiss as just the trade bits, which is sort of some of what we're talking about, the Annex 2 stuff. But as Geraldine has said, we've identified quite a bit of those, quite a number of those have human rights and equality implications, like lifts, something that I wouldn't have thought of before, but it's perfectly obvious when you think of it. And also, as you're saying, access to fundamentals for medical treatment or dental treatment or whatever. I think we're concerned that it's too qualified now. Am I right? Do you want to take over from?
Well, the thing I would just add simply is that for that committee, for the Windsor Framework Democratic Scrutiny Committee, in its exercise, as Geraldine says, its obligations around providing a report, providing an advice, and looking at the implications of using the stormont break, if that committee were to exercise its role in such a way as to make sure that the equality and human rights implications were looked at, I think you're talking about a public health implication in terms of the amalgam, for example, that could connect into some of those rights. then that can be part of the broader consideration that informs the decision on whether or not the storm break should be applied, because it's one of the impacts on the community, rather than just, the risk could be that it is a trade-focused analysis.
Yes.
So that's very much where the commissions would like to be of assistance, of course, and encourage the committee to engage fully with civic and civic stakeholders, including ourselves, to make sure that that report is as well informed as possible in the wide range of implications. And I think don't get overlooked in favour of trade. I think that's that at all.
Yeah, if I could maybe just pick up on the first question about the loss of payments in terms of foreign payments. We've recently published research of the impact of the impact of Brexit on women in Northern Ireland, and that was one of the issues that was picked up in that research report, and concerns were raised by those that the researchers engaged with in terms of the sort of the implications of loss of that funding. So it's very valuable research, and the Commission will then be taking forward its own recommendations arising out of that research shortly, following engagement with women. But I just wanted to say that was one of the issues that was raised in that report.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Patrick?
Yep. Look, thank you very much for your presentation. Really appreciate it. And to be honest, you've already answered a lot of the questions that I had. I suppose my first question, Alison, had been Connie's point just around the legal challenge, and I suppose the threshold for you to reach that. But I think that's been answered in detail. Just one point of clarification around that is, and I appreciate this is probably changes per case, is there an indicative timeline on that, or are there any kind of steps that you would look at along that process? And then, Geraldine, for yourself, again, you've answered most of the points already.
That was my plan.
It was around the 53% as well. I think, anecdotally, we've heard, and from speaking to different groups in different sectors, we're obviously all aware from our constituencies and across the board of the challenges that people are facing, particularly minority and underrepresented communities as well. So within that, I'm curious about the 53% as to whether or not there's, I suppose, a more specific breakdown within that of where the challenges have arisen, or the specific areas that the people have spoken in relation to. But you have already touched on that in detail, so I appreciate that. If there's any more detail on that as well, would be great.
Go to you first, Alison.
Sure.
Thanks.
We have to act very quickly, usually, but there is a process involved because we're an organisation, so it's not just one person, and we're spending public money, so we have to have commissioners approve the sign-off for any spending, and that's every new item of spending. So we can, for the High Court, if we go to the Court of Appeal, we have to go back and make a proper case for funding. Judicial reviews have to happen very quickly anyway. And it can be really tricky, and sometimes it means it costs us more actually, because we have to pay counsel to advise us very quickly and to turn around the papers. But I think what I would say is that we only go by what the law provides. So we review, we advise on what the law requires. It's never to do with our opinion about what's necessary. But some of those cases are, for example, illegal migration. We're talking about people who currently will be subject to these provisions, or maybe subject to detention without judicial oversight, all sorts of things like that. So we have to move very quickly. Cases, the length of time cases take is often outside of our control, but courts are getting very fast at, they're sort of really kind of putting us all in into order and making us move much more quickly than before. So I think it's becoming more effective and efficient. Did that answer? Was that sort of the?
No, absolutely. I mean, you'd already kind of given all the detail in response to Connie, but it was just to get that around the timeline. So 100%, that's really useful.
I think we would probably appreciate a bit longer to respond to things, but that's balanced out by the fact that judicial review is normally about an infringement of people's rights. So you need to move fast anyway. So
No, absolutely. Thank you.
Just in terms of the survey, we have undertaken awareness surveys now twice, and we're getting ready to go out with our third one. And it's about tracking people's views over time. And last year, the IREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, did the same survey so that we could track both directions. That figure in terms of the people who believed that their rights had already been impacted rose slightly from the first year to the second year. Roisin is the person who's over that survey and the nature of the questions that we ask. If you want to add to that, Roisin.
Yes, as Geraldine says, it's an annual survey that we've done, and we're now going to repeat it. So we'll get that's been a benchmark since we first do it, in terms to see what people's concerns were, and as Geraldine said, awareness of the Commission, awareness of our role, awareness of their rights under this as well. I think probably what has been really revealing about loss of rights, and particularly people's concerns about loss of rights, has actually come through in our research as well. That's provided sort of in-depth analysis of concerns about loss of rights. So I'd mentioned there, we've just published research on the impact of Brexit on women, and some of the concerns there about loss of rights from women in particular were around fear of loss of employment rights, for example, as a result of Brexit. That came over quite strongly, as well as fear of loss of rights in terms of accessing healthcare was another issue that came through in that. We have, as Geraldine mentioned at the start, we did research into the impact of Brexit on minority ethnic people here and migrant people here. And again, there was difficulties in terms of accessing services, entitlements to healthcare and other services as a result of changes that came in under the EUSS scheme as well, and difficulties with accessing that. So those are the type of issues that certainly have provided some in-depth analysis of what people's concerns are here in terms of loss of rights.
Just to add one point to that, you'll note from some maybe debate that there has been in the media of late, people from an ethnic minority background have been experiencing difficulty on occasions accessing services. Particularly in likes of health, but it also impacts on policing as well. It is largely anecdotal at this moment in time, and it's an area where we perhaps need to look at in more detail, because there seemed to be a presumption made in some service providers, specifically health, where there's an assumption made that these people who are coming looking for health care, their status may not be clear. And they're being asked to provide that every time they approach the hospital, approach a health provider in any context, GP, dentist, whatever. And ethnic minority people interpret that as being a direct result of Brexit. Now, the research papers that we have done to date, I did tell you that it was an evidential baseline, and the repeat of those particular research exercises will show clearly whether or not those fears are, really well founded, and if indeed Brexit has been a result of that. But it's maybe not necessarily a breach of their rights and their equality protections, but it's maybe how service providers are dealing with them, which is a consequence of Brexit, but not something that we can deal with necessarily under Article 2.
Yeah. Well, that's really useful, thank you. And I think even, I know we'd said about going into more detail in another presentation, I think that's a huge area that would be really useful to explore, so thank you all very much.
I'm just wondering if you can send us copies of those reports.
Absolutely.
And that'll be useful then.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Sinead, please.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers so far. Obviously, you have talked about us falling far behind, and we haven't made as much progress in rights since 1998. And in your paper, you indicated about, there was real concern about the divergence of rights between North and South. Do you believe that the structures are there in order to prevent and explore, say, that divergence of rights, that the right structures are in place for us to examine that? Because, it's quite clear. We can see that gap actually could widen quite significantly in the not too distant future, really, because we're at the very early stages of the Windsor Framework and the Article 2 piece in it. But already you can see clear water is emerging in relation to rights. So are the structures right?
Yeah, I think the structures are right for the time being. It's like everything else, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We are providing advice and guidance and recommendations to Westminster and to yourselves here in the executive. We've also made a representation to the Oireachtas Committee in Dublin. So it's about keeping everybody alert to the changes that need to be made. But the reality is, even between Northern Ireland and GB, there is a gap in legislation and the gap in protections. And we as an Equality Commission, for example, and I can only speak for us, we have been lobbying for many, many years in terms of the need for legislative reform and the increased protections that are needed here in Northern Ireland. So in terms of the legislation, it is down to the UK government and yourselves. But the reality is now we have the additional challenge process where we can actually escalate the matter through the joint working group, the specialised committee and the joint committee itself in terms of the UK government not maintaining its commitment. But I think for me, and probably for Alison as well, some of the important issues in relation to divergence of rights will be those frontier workers. And at the moment, there are people who access healthcare on a cross-border basis. And maybe Alison or Ailish might want to talk a little bit more about that, because that's an area of significant concern.
We can certainly talk about health. We have a paper in relation to that, which that may be something worth coming back to talk about, actually, just to get across all of our concerns about that. But just in relation to the structures, I think the structures probably are there. What's not there is the resource behind those structures to actually make the structures work. So there are all sorts of north, south and east and west dimensions to this, and Belfast Good Friday Agreement had north-south dimension, which influences how you interpret Article 2 Windsor Framework as well when looking at the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So that's already there, but it depends upon all the commissions being well funded and being able to do each of them do their job and then get together and discuss the divergence. So we do work with IREC, and we have a joint committee, but it would be, I think it would be inaccurate of me to say that that is working successfully. It's not yet. There aren't enough meetings and there just isn't the capacity. So we would like to see more capacity into the structures, but I can't think of any additional structures necessarily. It's just that like all things, the stuff can be there, but it's whether it's being used properly.
I mean, it's particularly important. I represent a border community, so the rights of workers and the rights of access is extremely important, and that equality of rights on the island is.
We've some terrific research papers we can send to you on frontier workers. We've got more coming, and also in relation to health and exactly that issue. So people working and living.
Yeah.
But did you want to?
Education as well.
And education, we talked about that this morning at our economic committee as well. It's really, there's rights in all of this. And then that's probably taking us on to the second thing that I want to ask about. Alison, you talked about the legislation. We have to be really careful when we're developing legislation that we kind of proof it on the basis of Article 2. How do you suggest that takes place in a detailed manner right across all of the departments?
One has been conducted, I think, by this.
Yeah.
Isn't it right?
Yeah.
Am I right about that?
Yeah, it's
the violence against women and girls strategy.
It's an impact assessment carried out by TO officials in terms of examining how the strategy is in compliance with the Article 2 commitments. There was another strategy that went through that it wasn't as detailed, or there was no impact assessment with it. But in reality, what we have been advocating for, not just for the Northern Ireland Executive and the Assembly, but the UK government as well, is that legislative bills coming through have an explanatory memorandum that explains in detail how Article 2 has been considered, and if indeed it is impacted, if the draft legislation is impacted by those commitments. So I think that's the starting point, and that's a process that really needs to be embedded both here and in London. And TO officials and NIO officials have been working really closely with both organisations, Ailish and Russian, in terms of how that might actually be done. And I think that some of the committees actually in Westminster have been very proactive in helping the officers raise those concerns.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to have to go on to three more. And Harry, please go ahead.
Okay,
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you. I'm just wondering, what ongoing engagement do you have with the EHRC in England and the SHRC in Scotland on areas of mutual interest, and is there a UK-wide joint commission structure or mechanism?
I'll start on this and then Alison can add, because our remits are split in two and others maybe have a slightly different approach, but we do meet on a regular basis. We have a 4 jurisdictions meeting that takes place once or twice a year, and we're in regular contact. Now, on the island of Ireland, our work with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission is a little bit more frequent, but there are open channels. We coordinate our work, we support each other right across the UK in terms of the work that's been undertaken, so that we can learn from each other and share what is relevant. And the Human Rights Commission have a stronger remit again.
Yes, one of the difficulties about working together is that our legislation is different. So we're founded in very different statutory, in a different statutory framework and using different principles. We were the first, so Northern Ireland had the first Human Rights Commission. And the others are similar to, based upon maybe the way we do it here, but not exactly the same. So, for example, Scotland doesn't have the ability to take cases in its own name. So they're quite significant differences. We work together as much as we can to avoid duplication, but sometimes it's simply not possible to agree. And human rights commissions can have different views and interpret legislation differently. So, and that's exactly how it should be. And in Northern Ireland, I think we have different concerns. We have the Windsor Framework now, so there is more, perhaps, divergence between the commissions. But it's not because we don't talk to each other and we don't try and work together. But there can be healthy disagreement on some things.
As you say, you're set up different and there's different needs.
Yes.
Also. Yep. Could an hour?
You sure? Go ahead.
You said accountable to Westminster, so I'm just wondering how often you have to report back, or who you report back to. Maybe you could tell me.
It's an ongoing thing, really. They come up with the money, so they pay for us all. They give us a budget, which we then have to decide how to spend. Commissioners decide on the strategic priorities, and then the money has to be found for those. In terms of reporting back, we do an annual report. We write regularly to the relevant ministers. We meet with the NIO. I think it's only fair to say that maybe reporting back has been less has been required of us in terms of reporting back than I would have expected, if that's not too cryptic. I sometimes wish there was more interest in what we're doing and maybe a response to what we initiate. And I think sometimes the legislative policy framework in GB is so different at the minute that can be forgotten about, but also can sometimes be seen as an outlier who's a bit of a troublemaker, which we take some pride in. No, not to be too flippant, but we do try and account to them, and they certainly make us account for every penny that we spend.
Just in terms of the Equality Commission, we are, we are sponsored, it's a devolved matter, equality is devolved, so our reporting mechanism is through TEO and through this committee. But both organisations report to Westminster in relation to our DMU work on an annual basis through our annual report.
I was just going to add that one of the unusual features which we appreciate in terms of our statutory functions in relation to Windsor Framework Article 2 is written into the statute is that we can request a written response from the Secretary of State to our annual report, and we've similarly with our annual report last year requested a written report from the Executive Office, although obviously with an executive not sitting at that time that was problematic, but we're still awaiting a response to last year's annual report from both sides, and unfortunately we didn't receive that as we concluded our report, which is due to be published now in June of this year's annual report.
Sorry, and just on that point then, have you passed the point then that can be incorporated into the report, or if
just in terms of the text of this year's report, will report on developments up until the end of this financial year, at the end of March, and as of the 31st of March we had not yet received a response from either the Secretary of State or TEO.
Could I take an opportunity just to make one really important point actually about the independence of the Human Rights Commission? we get allocated a budget, but it must be for us to decide how to spend it. We shouldn't be going to ask for money for cases which may be against the government, for example. But I think that is often misunderstood, and I think our independence is not always valued as it should be. And the centrality of that independence is what's really key, because if we're not independent, we're really not achieving very much at all. But that's where the sort of reporting can be uncomfortable at times. You know, we're not answerable to them, but we are accountable.
Yeah.
Thank you. Going to move on.
You, Chair.
Thank you. Brian, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your attendance on the papers and your answers so far. I mean, the context for this, as you'll be aware, the Northern Ireland Protocol was totally unacceptable to unionists in this Assembly, and for Harry and myself, our party took a different position from the other parties on this committee who wanted the rigorous implementation of the protocol. Our party took a stand and twice brought about legislative changes through the Windsor Framework and the Strengthening the Union document. So throughout, in the desire to have an open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, we have said throughout that could not be at the cost of our place within the UK internal market. And in terms of EU laws applying for manufacturing in Northern Ireland, we've said if we have access to the EU market, that cannot be at expense of our place within the UK internal market. So this is a follow-on to the whole issue of EU directives. It is our position that it should be for the Assembly and the Executive to determine what changes to domestic law follow on from updates in EU directives and decide whether they represent enhancements for local workers. We would say that Northern Ireland and the UK already has world-leading employment protections, but those constantly need to be updated and enhanced. And as I say, our focus will be on protecting our place within the UK market and preventing unnecessary divergence which would damage that place. So you've maybe touched on this already, but in your work, do you give due recognition and do you recognise the importance of recognising Northern Ireland's place within as an integral part of the United Kingdom?
Absolutely. And we welcome the fact that the Windsor Framework sought to address the democratic deficit, because we were always aware from the very outset that by virtue of leaving the EU, the ability for the Northern Ireland voice and the UK voice to be heard in terms of legislation was removed. However, I have to be clear that the Stormont break does not apply to the Article 2 commitment, because our equality legislation so far has been based on EU directives, and that was recognised by the government, and their willingness to engage with Article 2 commitments way back whenever the withdrawal agreement was first being negotiated was in terms of the commitments within the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and that is why it is limited very strictly to those 6 directives. The Stormont break applies to the goods provision, the Annex 2, but as we said earlier on, there is potential for some of those elements to impact on equality legislation. And the divergence of rights in terms of equality and indeed human rights, there is a gap already between Northern Ireland and GB, and we seek to close those gaps. We seek to make our protections here in Northern Ireland the best they can be. And I would add that we wouldn't necessarily, we have talked in the past about a single Equality Act. We wouldn't necessarily want just to replicate what happens in GB. We would want the gaps in that, the weaknesses in that, between it and best practice to be closed so that we are world leading. This is about making sure that everyone in our society is treated with dignity and respect at all levels, no matter who you are. And that's on an east-west, north-south basis. So we very much welcome the efforts that were introduced within the Windsor Framework to address that democratic deficit.
Alison, have you anything to add?
Yeah, just I would add this, that the state, as far as human rights protections is concerned, is the UK. Devolution has meant that there are differences within the UK. But the Windsor, or the withdrawal treaty and the legislation that followed was a democratic UK-wide decision. So it was legislated upon by MPs from here and from across GB. So it is taken care of in that way. Northern Ireland does have its say. Northern Ireland and no other region would have an ability to block, because Parliament didn't intend for it to have an ability to block. That could have been agreed in the relevant legislation, but it wasn't. So there is going to be divergence. There's divergence on lots of issues. So it's that's all I would say. It is a UK state issue, but the UK state has determined, with participation from Northern Ireland, that this is how it will conduct itself in relation to human rights standards.
I mean, the point is that we think that the Assembly must have the right, though, to examine EU directives, you know, and challenge if we feel it will be damaging. But we'll see how that all works out.
But this, of course, the stormont break can apply to the Annex 2. Obviously, you can have a look at that. But as I say, the time maybe would have been when the legislation was going through in relation to the stormont break. So that's concluded now as far as we're concerned, because somebody else decided how that would work. And it wasn't for us to decide, but it is for us to interpret.
Okay. Carol, please.
Thank you. There's a lot in that, so the papers when they follow would be really, really appreciated. My concern in the applicability motion and all that comes with it is that there's an awful habit here of screening things out. That's before Brexit, Windsor framework. So when it comes to equality and human rights, screening exercise, in my opinion, is used not to do a full EQIA. So, so in terms of, you know, the impact of Brexit and certainly the diversions of rights, you've already mentioned women, you've mentioned disabilities, employment, healthcare, others, and you also mentioned the status of asylum seekers and refugees. I think one of the biggest things, particularly in relation to what you just said, and I need clarification on it, if you have it, you've got the British Home Office through mayors are providing accommodation for asylum seekers. Once their status has been confirmed, they've got 7 days to leave. Okay? They then go on to a housing waiting list, which has systemically been a disgrace. And most asylum seekers and refugees prefer to live within the community of others. So in terms of all this, what will happen to those people, first of all? And then secondly, we have Section 75, we have all that, but yet in all, the inequalities are getting greater rather than lesser. So what else can we do in terms of this? Because our fear is that the divergence of rights is an excuse not to do rights, just as it is, and it was not to do Bill of Rights. There are some people in this place who don't do rights. So what do we do in circumstances like that?
In terms of the mayor's accommodation and refugees into dispersal accommodation, all of those issues, one of the reasons why we were so determined to challenge the Legal Migration Act is that it's not just about deportation of people or removing them to somewhere else.
Yeah.
It is about creating an acceptance that these people are not don't qualify for the same rights as those of us who were born here or might have moved here and have settled status. That's what's so damaging about this act. So it says that those people do not have the benefit of rights. And the minute you start picking out groups who don't have the benefit of rights, I mean, that's...
Alison, just to interrupt, those people have 7 days to get out.
Yeah.
The legislation for eviction here is greater.
Yeah.
So already there's a clear divergence of rights there.
It gets really difficult when you talk about the divergence of rights between groups of people as opposed to divergence of rights within the UK.
Fair enough.
I mean, this is probably, I always say something I shouldn't in these sessions, but one of the reasons behind Brexit was to control borders and to distinguish certain groups from others. We take a very strong view that that was a wrong thing to do. Mm-hmm. But that's a clear direction of travel, and asylum seekers and refugees have fallen foul of that more than anybody else at this stage. Yeah. hence our involvement in the immigration challenge. We're the only ones challenging it, actually. And it's partly because it's only happening in Northern Ireland because of the Windsor Framework, which adds to it. But the reason it all comes down to this idea that those people are not entitled to the same as the rest of us. And it goes right through to the standard of accommodation they might be moved into, whether they can get a private tenancy, whether they're entitled to all those things. Absolutely. You know, whether the kids can go to school, whether they can get a GP. So this is just the first stage in that, trying to establish, as we have in some other cases, that asylum seekers and refugees have the same rights as everybody else because they're human rights, not status rights or residency rights. But we're going to have to sort of tick this off as we go through, and that's probably going to be the first big challenge, and that will help in relation to all the other stuff, because all the rights should follow from that.
Brilliant. Can I just add that outside of that, outside of Brexit and the Article 2 commitments, each of the public authorities have an obligation to demonstrate their application of the equality duty, equality principle, and they do that through Section 75. And I know it has got a really bad name. It is seen by many as being a bureaucratic process. But I think we have
people who don't want to do rights,
well, yeah, I accept what you're saying, but in reality, each of the public bodies should be applying and demonstrating to their ministers, to the committees, that they have considered the implications of equality under Section 75, and that is maybe something that we're more than happy to come back and talk to you about at another session, because I think it's really important that we have a reinvigoration of what Section 75 is about and getting away from that bureaucratic process, but about putting people, all people, at the heart of our policy in Northern Ireland PLC, which is separate from the Brexit issue.
I think we were intending to come back to these issues, but from a different angle. Okay, ladies, thank you so much for that session today. It was a very meaty session, so really appreciate your time. Okay, members,
thank you
very much. Members, can I just get agreement that we can write to the Executive Office around the response to the Human Rights Commission's report? Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll just change over the names at the top table there, but I would like to invite forward, we've got our second session, so we have Kevin Hanratty, who's the Director of the Human Rights Consortium, Nuala Toman, who's the Interim Head of Innovation and Impact at Disability Action, and Fergal McPherson, who's the Policy and Public Affairs Manager at the Children's Law Centre. So thank you so much for coming along today. So we'll just change your names over, and then we can.
Okay.
Okay. So, who is going to start?
I'll kick off, Chair, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the invitation to speak with you today and present on our work. We really appreciate it. My name is Kevin Hanratty. I'm the Director of the Human Rights Consortium. I am responsible for the day-to-day management of all the activities and campaign work of the Consortium. And I'm joined by my two colleagues from two of our member organisations today who will help me take questions after I'm going to present the opening remarks, and then they'll help with questions. And I think their presence here today is representative of how we do business. All of our work is really conducted in collaboration with all of our members. We are a civil society coalition of 165 organisations drawn from across Northern Ireland. We were established in 2000, and our members come from a variety of backgrounds, from charities, NGOs, trade unions, and a variety of grassroots community groups of all shapes and sizes and geographic locations. But the unifying factor for the Consortium in many respects is the idea that strengthening the protection of human rights and its role, the role of human rights in our society, can only help make this a fundamentally better place and a fundamentally better society. Our work focused primarily on how we can deliver the promise of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement to make this a human rights compliant society and to create a human rights set of standards that is worthy of the name. And as a coalition, we have focused our campaigns on the delivery of that vision, but also on challenging any regressive measures that really have threatened or attempted to undermine existing human rights standards. So some examples of the work that we carry out: we have focused from our inception on the campaign to deliver a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement made a commitment to the protection and the vindication of the human rights of everyone in our society. And one of the main ways in which it envisaged doing that was through the delivery of a series of safeguards, and one of those was a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. And the Bill of Rights really was to underpin that idea of participation and protecting all communities here, but safeguarding human rights for everyone. And a Bill of Rights could have made a significant impact to how we govern this place, but also society generally in many ways. It could have added additional legal protections, enshrining fundamental rights and freedoms into law, providing legal protections for individuals and ensuring that their rights are respected by public authorities. It could have enhanced equality and non-discrimination protections, particularly for marginalised groups such as ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+ groups and individuals, and people with disabilities, and would have protected them from discrimination and ensured equal treatment under the law for those groups and individuals. It would have also supported the peace process and reconciliation by safeguarding human rights on an equal basis for everyone in our community, across all communities, and it would help promote a culture of respect and tolerance as well within that regard. It would have balanced state power by acting as a check on government power, limiting the state's ability to infringe upon citizens' individual rights arbitrarily and prevent abuses of power by those in authority. It would have helped individual empowerment around human rights by acting as a framework for citizens to challenge violations and seek remedies through legal challenges against public authorities. And finally, it would have brought us into closer alignment with our international human rights obligations, to which the UK and devolved governments as in turn are duty bound to comply with. So those are some of the impacts the Bill of Rights might have made, and despite widespread cross-community public support for a Bill of Rights over 25 years, we still unfortunately do not have that delivered in Westminster legislation as outlined in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. In the context of continued threats to our existing human rights standards, some of which have been outlined by the previous presenters, the political instability that we've seen here in recent years, and the unprecedented pressure on public services and the range of inequalities that we've seen emerging in this society, we think a Bill of Rights is important now as it has ever been. And it's something we continue to campaign for and would seek your support in challenging the Westminster government, but also the actions of the Executive Office to do more in that regard if possible. The other area of work that I'll talk about, we focus on, is international human rights standards. We carry out a range of training, research and campaigning activities to assist our members to participate in UN review mechanisms to hold the UK government to account for their compliance with several international human rights treaties at the UN. The UK government is a signatory to seven covenants covering a range of human rights grounds. But for us, assessing how those duties are complied with at a public authority level, both at the Assembly and public authorities more broadly, is often quite difficult. So any work that the committee could help in creating greater transparency around that would be very much welcomed. And these are the exact same treaties that we would like to see incorporated in a Bill of Rights. So there is a direct relevance to that work as well. As a coalition, we also have an eye to what's happening in other parts of the UK. We work regularly with members and sister human rights coalitions in Scotland and Wales to regularly assess what is developing in those jurisdictions and how we can learn from them and add to the best practice here. So we look with an envious eye to what's happening in Scotland and Wales, who have proceeded to use their own devolved powers to incorporate some of those international human rights treaties. And unfortunately, what we found really in comparison is that Northern Ireland is rapidly being left behind, and we are differentiating ourselves from the rest of the UK. So there's an equality issue there for us, particularly. In recent years, the Scottish Government have incorporated the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child into domestic law, and looks set in the coming months to incorporate the Scottish Human Rights Bill, which will incorporate the remainder of their international human rights treaty obligations into Scottish law. So we would encourage this committee to look at the powers of the Assembly and the powers that are available via devolved institutions to see what can be done in a similar regard, to copy the measures that are taken in Scotland and Wales and investigate what can be done similarly via Assembly legislation. You've had the dedicated mechanisms here in the both commissions talk about Article 2. That is an area that we are particularly interested as well and have spent many years focusing on since the Brexit referendum. The impact of the UK's withdrawal from the EU has been significant on human rights protections in Northern Ireland, and is why we've spent many years campaigning specifically for the Article 2 protections within the Windsor framework to give a degree of protection for the rights that were so important here, that were derived from EU directives and regulations, and came at a time when there was very little additional rights legislation emerging either from the UK or from the Northern Ireland Assembly. These protections constitute a non-diminishing commitment to the rights that were in place on the 31st of January 2020, and they will be very important moving forward in terms of keeping some of those standards in place. But we believe that we have a range of concerns around their current application. The UK government in particular have proceeded with a number of pieces of legislation that we believe are in violation of Article 2. The Legacy Act most recently was found in the High Court to be in violation of Article 2 specifically, but also the Illegal Migration Act and the forthcoming Rwanda Bill, which looks set to pass through Parliament today, we both believe are in violation of those Article 2 protections as well as the European Convention on Human Rights. Which leads me on to the final area of work where we place an emphasis, and that is the Human Rights Act. The other element of trying to create additional human rights protections in Northern Ireland via the Good Friday Agreement was a commitment to incorporate the European Convention of Human Rights into domestic law, and that was done via the mechanism of the Human Rights Act. And to say that that legislation has been a success story would be an understatement. It has been the cornerstone of protecting human rights in this jurisdiction and across the UK for over 20 years. It is a fundamental piece of human rights legislation that we need to protect. Unfortunately, however, over the last 10 years, what we've seen is a UK government who seem determined to challenge it, to threaten it, to undermine it, and seek to scrap it. We have worked with civil society organisations across the UK to challenge that, specifically because how valuable it is, important it is in terms of protecting human rights. And those efforts seem to have paid off, not in no small part due to the fact that it was a fundamental commitment of our peace process. But unfortunately, in recent years, what we've seen is a transfer of that aggression towards the Human Rights Act towards specific groups who access convention rights. And I'm thinking specifically of migrants and asylum seekers here. And via the Illegal Migration Act and the Rwanda Bill, they have targeted efforts to limit the access of those groups and individuals to the convention rights, which we think is contrary both to the principles of the Good Friday Agreement, the Human Rights Act, but also those Article 2 powers in the Windsor framework. So we would urge the committee to whatever extent possible to become involved in these conversations, to become involved in the scrutiny of human rights around all of these issues. Those are just 4 examples of the areas of work that we're engaged in. To summarise, really, our work as a coalition focuses on expanding the suite of human rights protections that we want to see applicable in Northern Ireland, but unfortunately most of the measures that we've seen introduced, certainly at a UK level, have attempted to move us backwards in recent years. We very much welcome the Assembly and Executive being restored and look forward to working with committees like yourselves to try and push forward and expand the level of protection for human rights in this jurisdiction moving forward. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Okay, so I just want to pick up on that point that you started, really, in terms of the Bill of Rights and the disappointment felt by your consortium in terms of the work that was put in and the evidence that was submitted to demonstrate the need for the Bill of Rights. And I just wonder if you could speak a bit more in terms of the symbolism that was felt by it not being taken forward, you know, even in terms of the ability for the preamble to really set the tone for good relations going forward in the future. And I suppose in terms of us as a scrutiny committee, you've talked there about the expanding the suite of protections, and again the evidence that was submitted by the many organisations through that Bill of Rights process, you know, demonstrated where there were even particular areas of public policy and law that could be brought forward for specific sections of society. I'm just wondering, is there a role for us as an Executive Office Committee in terms of trying to drive forward some of those legal protections that you've outlined?
Yeah, I'll maybe start off with the symbolism question, maybe hand over to Nuala and Fergal for the other elements. I think the level of work that went into the ad hoc committee process was very, very admirable over a course of a couple of years. We were very disappointed over the past 20 years that it had taken so much time to even get to that point where there was a committee process, and we had various iterations of looking at content and looking at the potential around a Bill of Rights, including a Bill of Rights form, advice from the Human Rights Commission, which was not taken forward. And eventually in the new decade new approach, we had that ad hoc committee process. I think the evidence, I would agree, Chair, the evidence to that committee symbolised the scale of the gaps in terms of human rights protections that exist in Northern Ireland. And there are areas that I think, historically speaking, in terms of the role of the Assembly, that would have benefited directly from having some more direct legislative tools in place in terms of human rights. I'm thinking particularly around social welfare reform between 2013 and 2015, when we didn't have the right to social assistance and the right to an adequate standard of living embedded in law. I would like to think that would have made a substantive difference in terms of how welfare was rolled out in Northern Ireland. I know we've had various mitigations in Northern Ireland, but I think we're seeing the long play out of those Westminster delivered pieces of legislation in terms of equality, human rights, poverty, child poverty, health, waiting times in terms of our NHS. I think there's a substantive evidence base there, both through the ad hoc committee process and in some of the inequalities that are being presented post-COVID, to say that from a decision-making point of view and a legislative point of view, having a Bill of Rights in place that was in line with the international standards, in particular ISESCA, or the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, would have made a difference in terms of how decisions were reached. I think in terms of the symbolism, the Bill of Rights plays a really important place in the institutions here in Stormont. I think we forget about the sort of bespoke nature of the arrangements here when we think about a Bill of Rights. We are the Stormont executive of the Assembly. The executive is a mandatory coalition of quite different parties, as I'm sure you're more aware than I am. And asking those parties to make a functional, effective government that is compliant with human rights standards can be, I suppose, a difficult ask. But if we had the backing of a blueprint of sorts via those international human rights standards, I think it would have made a significant difference in terms of some of the equality impacts that we would have, and the outcomes that we would have seen coming from the Assembly over the last number of years. So I think it plays a really fundamental role in terms of those safeguards and ensuring that we are compliant and all of the outputs of the Stormont executive are compliant with human rights. I'll hand over to Nuala or Fergal to pick up on some of the other points.
Thank you. In regard to the views of disabled people in respect to the Bill of Rights and the potential impact of having a Bill of Rights enacted into law, from our perspective, this is a really pivotal moment. We're emerging from a very severe political crisis. We remain in the midst of an economic, social, public finance and health cost of living and health emergency. We recently provided evidence to the United Nations that demonstrated the grave and systematic abuse of the rights of disabled people that has continued since 2016 as part of the follow-up to the inquiry into the impact of welfare reform. The recent, the recent budget has again resulted in the erosion of the rights of disabled people. We've seen reductions in access to health. We have seen disabled people being asked to discharge from hospital to residential care at a time whenever the emphasis has been on deinstitutionalisation and when we are awaiting the outcomes of the Muckamore inquiry. So from our perspective, that is extremely concerning. But to move from that into benefit, if we take housing, for example, to have the right to a home enshrined in law would substantially improve the position of disabled people. Because if you're looking at the development of policy approaches and investment, to have the right to a home at the forefront of development would substantially change the current position where we only have 1,111 adapted social homes available in the whole region, which leaves disabled people in incredibly unsafe and living in an unsafe and unsanitary conditions. As a result of the lack of availability of adapted social homes, we've also seen a rise in the displacement of disabled people within housing estates as a result of hate crime, and in the context of the coercive control of estates. Now, if we had proper rights protections, we would have valid ways that all of those actions could be challenged within the courts. But sadly, where we're at, we're left in limbo. And if we reflect on Geraldine's comments previously in the media, where she referred to the gap between this place and the UK and Ireland in terms of legislative protections being so vast that we are at risk of no longer being a developed country. And that is stark.
Fergal, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just reflect, since the conclusion of the ad hoc committee process, we have been witness to what I would describe as further regression in the lived experiences of children and young people here. And the urgency with which the issues we were raising then need to be addressed now is felt even more acutely. And I suppose the profound, often life-limiting impact that deterioration and stagnation in our public services is having on children and young people cannot be underestimated. And they were being badly let down before and have continued to be failed since. And look, all of the members here today will take calls in their constituency offices that we receive at our advice centre as well. And will be well aware, because we take referrals from constituency offices too, about the scale and complexity of the issues facing children and families and communities today. I think we need to name that and need to be really honest about the state of things, whether that's the crisis in special educational needs provision, the barriers faced by children with disabilities in accessing the right to education, whether that's in family breakdown as a result of the failure to provide respite and residential provision in healthcare, whether it's the shocking levels of child poverty that are worse than the rest of the UK, whether it's those issues or any number of others. And I think the conclusion that we have reached as the Children's Law Centre is that the framework that exists to protect and fulfil the rights and dignity of children and young people is not good enough. And that's why the necessity of a Bill of Rights is as crucial, if not more so today than it was when it was first agreed to. And we need to, I think, very carefully reflect on what we mean when we talk about a Bill of Rights, because it is essentially saying, here are the values we agree to as a society, and here's a contract that we will have with our people. And it should be the floor through which we do not fall. And we are failing the most vulnerable citizens in our communities as a result of gaps in systems of protections that can be not fixed overnight, but certainly addressed somewhat by a Bill of Rights. And I think the urgency with which we need to seriously get our heads around with what else can we do, because the additional point that I think is useful and potentially important for this committee to think about is, as Kevin has reflected in his opening remarks, the role of the Executive Office in human rights and equality, and the potential coordinating role that they can have, and the role that this committee can therefore play in actually drilling down into who is complying with what, the transparency in terms of the monitoring of the conventions that, yes, have been agreed to by the UK, but therefore have a place here in Northern Ireland as well. And so I would just strongly reinforce the point that human rights through a Bill of Rights need to be seen as something with which we can build better, more effective, more child rights and human rights more broadly compliant systems of public services.
Connie?
Thank you, all of you, for coming in today. I think there's some extremely concerning points for us to take forward as a committee. Nuala, I think it was quite harrowing. Correct me if I'm wrong, you said we're at risk here of no longer being considered a developed country. That's not good enough. It just simply isn't. And something that I'd like to speak to both you and Fergal about is especially concerned about the experience of children, young people, special educational needs in our education system. And I think that's something that should be a big concern for this Assembly. Do you think that is something that would be helped if we had, for example, the United Nations Committee for the Rights of Disabled People, if we had incorporated that into laws? Would that be one way that we could tackle that with an overarching legislative framework?
So my initial reflection is that there is an outstanding commitment to deliver a Bill of Rights that looks at what else is necessary beyond the ECHR. And I think all of the evidence points to that being the best mechanism by incorporating the various conventions and treaties to deliver those additional protections. And that's certainly the view that we would have in terms of incorporation of the standards of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child through an inclusive Bill of Rights. And you're right to point out that there are particularly vulnerable cohorts in our communities who are having their rights denied day and daily, and the scale and complexity of some of the issues is what concerns me, in that we're well used to taking phone calls and giving advice, but over the course of the last decade it's harder and harder to get a solution, and it seems like the systems are not capable of finding them anymore, and we're not getting effective remedies in the ways we normally would have done previously. We're having to take more judicial reviews and still not finding a remedy in many cases. And so I think what we need is every possible mechanism to uphold people's fundamental rights, and that requires additional protection. So we have to go back to the framework that was agreed and build from there.
Thank you. Firstly, our main priority is to ensure that the UK government fulfils its obligation to deliver a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. We feel that that is the strongest mechanism through which to protect the rights of disabled people. Unfortunately, we have seen that commitment not realised for decades. So in the context of reflections on incorporating the UNCRPD into law, our position is that that commitment should be outlined within the disability strategy, and that the disability strategy should have very clear commitments within it around legislative reform. In respect of incorporation of the UNCRPD on the floor of the Assembly, we would of course support that, but I think, as Fergal has outlined, the strongest position is for that to be incorporated as part of a Bill of Rights. But we would also look to the devolved administration and to all of you to consider ways in which we can enhance rights protections through the mechanisms that we have, whilst at the same time continuing to press for the incorporation of the Bill of Rights into law.
The only thing I'll add to that is that when the UK signs up to each of these individual international treaties, particularly the UNCRC and UNCRPD and others, there is a duty as part of that treaty to incorporate the convention as effectively into domestic law. And in the various reviews that happen periodically every 4 years in Geneva, the repeated request that comes from most of those committees is that the UK is feeling in its duty to incorporate those covenants appropriately, and that the best mechanism to do that in Northern Ireland is the Bill of Rights process that has been committed to in the Good Friday Agreement.
Thank you. Sorry, Emma, please.
Thanks a million, Chair, and thanks to you all for the presentation. I suppose I would share your frustration around the Bill of Rights, and we referred to that during the last presentation. You outlined there the public support across the board. I don't know why the DUP and the UUP refused to implement the Bill of Rights during the last mandate. I don't understand that we consulted the public on it, and over 80% came back to tell us across the board from all political perspectives that they wanted to see a Bill of Rights. So I suppose I would share your concerns there, and it's something that greatly frustrates me given that this commitment is 26 years old now. I would ask you, because the reference has already been made to the whole Brexit process and how, I mean, an awful lot of that was a dog whistle. I would appreciate your views on how the very real life implications for minority groups, for children, young people, for people living with disabilities, how all of that feeds into the public discourse that leads to the rise of hate speech and harassment and a lack of awareness, which in turn then breeds racism, sectarianism and all the other negative discriminatory thinking practices that we see that are becoming more mainstream by government bills such as the Rwanda legislation and all of these things that are rooted in hatred and in I suppose a lack of compassion for your neighbour and not understanding their situation. So I don't know if you've got comments in that regard.
I'll kick off and Fergal come in if they like. I think as regards the Bill of Rights process, I think we also need to be clear that the duty to deliver a Bill of Rights is the UK government's duty. The idea of requiring political consensus in Northern Ireland, the NIO, the UK government say to us that that's in line with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement.
I appreciate that and understand that was the process, but the response from political parties here very much let them off the hook. In my view, we went through a whole process in which all the parties had signed up to it. They had signed up to it in 1998 and then refreshed that sign up with NDNA in 2020. And the agreement was that we were going to have a committee here which was going to do that groundwork, and then at the very last then produced papers to say that they didn't view it as necessary. So it,
Yeah, I think it was surprising that some parties maybe took the position that they did. But I suppose even the design of the NDNA committee, was quite limited in itself in terms of, it was a committee to investigate the possibility of having a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. That was 22 years after the Good Friday Agreement. We thought it should have gone far beyond that. It should have been looking at direct content and details and binding standards on the Assembly rather than just the idea of whether it should happen. The politics around it, we've argued with the UK government for many years that it's their duty to take it forward, and the idea of political consensus is contained nowhere in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So parties are obviously entitled to their own views around how human rights are incorporated or not. We're disappointed that we don't have the support of all the political parties for that moving forward. But I suppose as one of the extension of this idea of political consensus, as one of the parties on the ad hoc committee said, at what stage does the idea of political consensus become a political veto? And unfortunately that's what we have. The UK government are refusing to move forward without that consensus. We think that's a mistake. That's not compatible with the Good Friday Agreement. And we think the only people that are suffering in regards to that are the people who need the benefits of additional human rights standards in Northern Ireland. So we would urge parties to please work with us and to please move that Bill of Rights process forward. In terms of that, maybe Nuala and Fergal come in on some of the other question around sort of hate crimes and racially motivated attacks and the discourse around that. I think there's a worrying othering of refugees and asylum seekers happening at the minute. I think it is not distinct to just England or other parts of the UK. It has infiltrated here as well, and it is prevalent in some discourse as well. And we've seen attacks on people's homes. We've seen hate speech written on walls. Some of our members have been directly impacted by that. I think from our perspective, the fundamental thing to remember that the sort of secret's in the title. It's human rights. It's not rights for specific groups. It's not rights for specific communities. It's rights for every individual that lives in our society. And it's again why those protections around equality measures, around hate crime legislation, around all the provisions that in a Bill of Rights that might overlap with the treatment and protection of ethnic minority communities need to be fundamentally strengthened. And Nuala mentioned the social inclusion strategy, but we're referring to international standards. From my understanding, the civil society representatives in all those social inclusion strategy working groups recommended the incorporation and the adherence with international human rights standards, and that would be a good starting point to take forward. Maybe Nuala or Fergal want to add to that?
I suppose just in relation to political division around the Bill of Rights, from the disabled person's perspective, disability is a cultural identity that unites all disabled people, and the disabled people that we represent would like to see the Bill of Rights enacted into law to provide protections against the very severe, heartbreaking experiences that people have had to live through in recent decades, and which, our recent casework, we have people who are unable to access their life-saving machinery in their homes because they cannot afford to turn on their electric, and those people need the right to an adequate standard of living. And that is just an example of why rights protections are so required. In terms of Brexit, there's no doubt the discussions around Brexit were incredibly divisive, and as Kevin has referred to, have created this process of othering. That public discourse has been associated with an increase in hate crime and hate speech. Alongside that, Brexit has also directly impacted on the regression of the rights of disabled people, and that is in respect of access to medicine. Because the very implementation of Brexit means that people cannot receive the medicine for which they are, which is prescribed for them. So, for example, within ADHD, there is a particular formula of ADHD medication that is no longer readily available within this region, and you have a population of people who have had to adjust their medication as a result of that, and they have experienced severe mental distress and dysregulation as a result of that. We have also saw challenges in terms of disabled people's right to independent living and right to travel. Formerly, disabled people could use their blue badge in other European countries. Now it's on a case-by-case basis, and it's very, very difficult for a disabled person to know if they can or cannot park. And all of this, when you talk about parking, it may not seem, to be such an important issue, but for a disabled person who is a wheelchair user and who has a right to go on holiday, that could be the difference between that holiday happening or not happening. In the period since Brexit, we have seen the regression of rights of disabled people, and the evidence that was presented in August from a UK-wide coalition of disabled people referenced that this has been that the position taken by the UK government has been deliberate and repetitive, and that has then resulted with more and more disabled people being displaced onto the margins of society.
Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just briefly, and I will be brief. I think the first point I would make is these shocks, and we've experienced a number of them over the course of the last decade: Brexit, pandemic, cost of living crisis, repeatedly expose the weakness in the framework of protections that we have. On the Brexit point specifically, I would say I am beyond profoundly concerned about the narrative that the UK government or elements of it are weaponising in the public discourse. I don't think that's the political mainstream here, but I think it requires constant political leadership to bat it away and deal with it. And the reason why I say that I'm so profoundly concerned about it is because it has aided this understanding of human rights as these meddlesome things that stop anyone making a meaningful decision. And that is wrong. My human rights are only fulfilled when yours are too. And we need to get back to the point where we understand the nature of human rights in that regard. And that's why I think it's so important that we go back to the framework that currently exists and build from there through a Bill of Rights. And the last point I would make, just because I think it's also related to a question that Sinead asked in the previous session, the most recent examination of the UK by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child did make a specific recommendation about the outstanding need for a proper assessment of the rights implications for children as a result of the UK's exit from the European Union. We have done our own that will be published in a week's time. Limited though it is, it touches on things such as policing and safeguarding and health and education, and all of these things obviously have implications that I think haven't properly been examined in the fullest possible detail yet.
Okay. Actually, Sinead can bring you in next.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to kind of really ask you about what your assessment is of the accountability within government, how we're living up to our obligations within Article 2, but also about the existing duties as well. And there appears to me to be no sense how each department evaluates their performance against equality duties. And Section 75 appears to me to be a tick box exercise within the departments. And I think that Nuala and Fergal both talked in terms of human rights in relation to poverty and the impact that it has on housing rights and child poverty. And we spent a whole day yesterday talking about poverty and the various impacts. And those living in poverty, they have very little human rights. And there is a real regional disparity in relation to poverty as well. And how do we evaluate and protect people, that their human rights are not negated because of their postcode? And we see it right across every department within government, that we have such great disparity within all of this, from housing right through, as I say, to child poverty. How do we protect the human rights of people that are poor and people that live in poor areas?
Thank you. So firstly, in respect of Section 75 equality duties, there has been great disparity in terms of how those duties have been addressed across departments. What we have observed, certainly when the institutions were not functional, is a lack of understanding in some departments about what Section 75 is and how it operates. And I suppose what we need to get to a point where there is an acceptance that these are statutory duties and statutory obligations, and that they provide a framework for effective financial decisions and policy making, and that not adhering to Section 75 duties is illegal. And ultimately what we need to put in place is a clear framework that can be implemented across all departments, because there are perhaps 3 departments that progress Section 75 duties well. There are other departments that perform less well. In terms of impacts on moving away from a postcode lottery and addressing the challenges which people living in poverty face, we have significant statutory obligations that have never been fully realised within this jurisdiction. Section 75 can operate as a budget decision making tool. That has never happened. Section 28E of the 98 Act, as amended by the St Andrews Agreement, creates a statutory obligation to target resources on the basis of objective need, that is often misinterpreted as just a requirement for an anti-poverty strategy. But there is a judgment by Justice Tracy that directly refers to the statutory requirement to target resources on the basis of objective need. If that happened, we would significantly transform this society. One of the biggest challenges that we have is that objective need is currently undefined. So, perhaps that is something that the members of this committee could consider, how to define objective need and relate that to both financial decision making and policy and legislative development. And one other aspect is perhaps around the administration in around kind of 2010, there was an emphasis on embedding the Brown principles within policy development, and that effectively placed human rights obligations at the front of policy development. That has slipped off the agenda, and it doesn't appear that departments at this point in time are taking that human rights based approach, and to do this would vastly improve the lives of people across the region.
Did you want to add to that?
Not really. Just to say that, in line with what we're saying about a Bill of Rights and the incorporation of those standards, there are, particularly around ISESCR, there are principles that would support the progressive implementation of social and economic standards. I'm thinking particularly of the idea of progressive realisation over time. So some people misinterpret the idea of the right to housing or the right to health or the right to an adequate standard of living as someone being able to go to the courts tomorrow and say, I have this right, realise it for me now. It's not. It doesn't work in that way. It's about progressively realising that right over time through a series of policies, legislation and decisions by public authorities. But there is also the idea of minimum core obligations in terms of each right, breaking it down and looking at what are the minimum core obligations and what are the standards that need to be met to actually realise that right. In terms of the Northern Ireland Assembly, Stormont, that's on this committee, that's also work that could be done to establish for a Northern Ireland context what are those minimum core obligations. That would play a really important role in informing compliance with those rights if we did incorporate them, but also in terms of our decision making under current legislation as well.
I suppose one of the things that's interesting, the Northern Ireland Executive are making a case to Treasury for further funding based on objective need. Now, so therefore that tells me that money should be spent on the basis of objective need, and that would mean that you would be funding and spending money in places which require more interventions than others. So if the objective, if the need is made, that case is made, then that case in terms of regional balance is probably made as well.
Absolutely, I agree. But in that regard, it's not dissimilar to other policies and strategies that we've seen emerging in Northern Ireland. We have a mental health strategy here that talks about massive mental health inequalities, but yet solutions are not framed in terms of equalities or human rights. And that's replicated across a number of policies. So I think that you're absolutely right.
And just, Carol, do you want to come in now?
No, I'm here.
Oh, you're okay. Sorry, I thought I've actually got Harry next.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Appreciate it. Good to see you all again. In terms of the 165 groups represented, would it be possible to give us a breakdown of the groups, or would that be?
Well, there's a full list of the groups available on our website,
okay,
so you can see here. So we don't really categorise them. There are a number of different sectors and types of organisations covered in that membership, and they cover like a diversity of geographic regions across Northern Ireland as well. Yeah, rural and urban. I think most of the main bigger charities and trade unions tend to be located in Belfast, but then we have a range of rural groups, women's groups, community groups of that nature that would be located in rural areas, but also in the northwest and bigger towns as well.
And in terms of Scotland and Wales, you said that we could learn from their motto, and also was a comment that we were left behind. Why would you feel we were left behind?
Well, I suppose it's a number of factors. there haven't been very many pieces of legislation emerging from the Assembly that on the face of the bill promote equality or advance equality and human rights protections, whereas in the rest of the UK, certainly in Scotland and Wales, they've either taken a treaty-based approach to incorporate specific treaties from the UN directly into Scottish or Welsh law, or they've taken a sectoral or issue-based approach. Like Wales, for instance, at the minute is seriously considering adopting the right to adequate accommodation in domestic law as a human right. So there are different ways to approach the same issues. And we're also being left behind in terms of, Nick Geraldine mentioned it already, in 2010, the rest of the UK adopted the Equality Act. That wasn't adopted in Northern Ireland and probably should have been, but that has left us behind in terms of some of the provisions of that bill as well. So there are ways of learning from other parts of the UK and other jurisdictions across the world, but we need the political will to act first of all, and we sort of haven't seen that historically, so it'd be great to see that moving forward.
Could I add to that? So in terms of just some distinctions and disparities, Scotland has the right to a home enshrined in legislation and has since 2003. So that's an example of a legislative gap. Wales obviously have moved to a needs-based formula. I know there is a move here, which really sees a disparity in terms of the public finance approach, and then Scotland has further deviations in terms of public finance. England and Wales have stronger protections for disabled people accessing taxis in respect of here. So in England and Wales, a taxi cannot refuse to take a disabled person. We don't have those protections here. And as Kevin has pointed out, the lack of progress in terms of the Equality Act 2010 means that in this jurisdiction where disabled people remain unprotected from indirect discrimination, and that has a significant impact in terms of access to services by disabled people. And those are only a simple list. I mean, the list goes on. We could list off more examples of legislation that has been enacted elsewhere that hasn't translated to here. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Please.
So, what discussions have you had with the NIO and the British government about the Bill of Rights here?
Well, we've had ongoing historic conversations with the UK government at different levels, primarily through the NIO and through ministers. The standard answer in terms of progressing the Bill of Rights is the lack of political consensus here, which unfortunately has been the go-to answer for many years. Clearly we feel we need to move beyond that, and in fact it was never an element of the Bill of Rights process that we're aware of as regard to that commitment in the Good Friday Agreement. So discussions are ongoing, but unfortunately there is a seemingly ideological opposition to the idea of extending additional rights to here. Back in 2010 under a former government, when we had the consultation following the Human Rights Commission's proposals to the Secretary of State and the UK government at that stage, we were told we couldn't have additional rights here because it might create inequalities across the UK, and that we might have access to rights here that the rest of the UK don't. In fact, now the opposite has happened. The rest of the UK have access to rights that we don't, and Nuala's just answered that question. So I think those arguments don't stand, and there is just, I suppose, an opposition there at a political level to taking the Bill of Rights forward that we think is unacceptable.
Okay, and then the other question is, I mean, what can we do in absence of governments stepping up their responsibility and parties here using vetoes to block human rights for the most disadvantaged, for example, people with disabilities?
It's a difficult question to answer. I suppose primarily we would continue just to ask for a revisiting of the Bill of Rights process, as we've outlined why we think that's the best and the primary vehicle by which change should happen. likewise, I think there are, we've outlined there might be mechanisms to follow suit with what happens in Scotland and Wales, but that may be subject to similar vetoes, depending upon the approaches that are taken to that. I don't know, and how political parties respond. But I think there is a severe need to take that forward. I think Fergal and Dula have evidenced the fact that the gaps in these rights protections are really reaching a point now where they're incredibly having an incredible impact on people's lived reality. The fundamental principle around human rights at an international level is the dignity of the human person. That has been fundamentally eroded on a day-to-day basis. So in terms of solutions, we know what the solutions are that we want to see taken forward. I suppose we look to politicians to sort of join those campaigns and those efforts. Dilla, Fergal, maybe go ahead.
I think it would be really beneficial if this committee could put forward a united case to the Secretary of State for the requirement of a Bill of Rights for the region to protect people. So that could be one action.
Even though there's no political agreement on it, Nuala?
Well, I think it would be really useful if, I suppose...
I'm talking about practical, so I hear what you're saying. So what's going to happen here is people, like unionism, has vetoed human rights and will continue to veto human rights. And us in this committee, the right to the Secretary of State for Human Rights is going to be vetoed by the DUP. So I'm talking about practical things, like, for example, if there was an agreement to have the implementation of a Bill of Rights here by the British government, in the way that reproductive rights for women were vetoed, in the way that language rights for people was vetoed, then there is a need to implement the Bill of Rights in the exactly same way. But,
we would just ask for people to kind of consider how to work together to reach political agreement, because we have outlined evidence around how the lack of rights protections is impacting on the daily lives of disabled people. During the COVID-19 crisis, disabled people accounted for the majority of deaths. That is a breach of the right to life of disabled people and older people. Yeah. And I suppose that what we would like to see is political agreement around the importance of rights protections. That was one practical suggestion. I suppose the other mechanisms are to consider in what ways can the other gaps that we have identified be addressed. Now, what we would say is the Bill of Rights should be at the forefront. But there are ways in terms of the social inclusion strategies that are being brought forward to ensure that rights protections are embedded within those strategies. I suppose this committee could act as an accountability mechanism for human rights protections and bring greater transparency in terms of how for example, when the progress reports are being put together to benchmark progress against international treaties. It'd be really good to see that work brought to this committee so the committee could scrutinise it, so it's quite transparent.
So, say for example, a practical example would be, see the stuff around Section 76? Would it be possible, or do you think it would be a good progressive move if we got, for example, the head of civil service in, which I think we need to talk about how departments and even permanent secretaries should be implementing Section 75. Because if they implemented Section 75, then the items on the Bill of List would be this size, the Bill of Rights would be this size. All they have to do is implement Section 75.
So the frustration you reflected earlier about, I guess, what appears, at least in some cases, as a tick box approach to what Section 75 is a frustration that we have felt for many years. And I think the Chief Commissioner of the Equality Commission referred to a reinvigoration of Section 75, and I guess if the Assembly's been at this for 25, 26, however many years. If the Equality Commission's been at it for that long, if civil society have been pushing at it for that long too, and we're still not getting it right, a reinvigoration is the lowest possible thing we should be seeking. The purpose of Section 75 at the time was, well, it was seen as revolutionary in many ways, but actually the realisation has not taken place of what it was intended to do. And we, time and time again, see screening exercises and other outworkings of Section 75 of really low quality, of really poor understanding of what it means in practice. And I don't want to appear too harsh about what goes on within departments and doing that and delivering it, but ultimately it misses the point if it's not doing its job properly. And I think in terms of decision making, we need to return to what was intended in 1998, which was meaningful adherence to equality and human rights provisions, and we're not having that. So I share your frustration, and I hope that comes across today. And that is potentially a role for this committee as well, in terms of something to take forward too.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, in terms of any potential conversations you're having with the Shadow Secretary of State, Hilary Benn? I'm conscious of your comments there around that, the need for consensus has never appeared anywhere. I'm just wondering, have you spoken to the Labour government, it's probably the incoming government, what they will do in this space?
We've spoken with Hilary Benn, and I think he's still very much at the early stages of trying to come to terms with the lay of the land in terms of the rights landscape here. He obviously was very focused on the Legacy Act in particular and how that sat with the Article 2 commitments and the Good Friday Agreement and the human rights indeed. We have made the case to him that the Bill of Rights needs to, from our point of view, needs to be front and centre in the Labour Party's agenda, whether they're in government or not. But we'll see how that plays out in terms of practical support.
Well, thank you very much. Thank
you very much. Really appreciate that.
Nina, Kevin and Fergal, thank you so much.
Can we get that stuff? Sorry, Nina, see the list of gaps in terms of the discrimination that we're placing on. If we could have those, just as a reminder of what we're starting over, it would be really helpful.
Thank you, Carol, for that suggestion. And we've got our strategy. Thank you, guys. You're free to go. We have our strategy session next week, members, and I think we'll come back to this because I think we're now at the point, I think we all sort of know what are the key issues that we want to be focusing on going forward. But the issue around getting the Equality Commission back in to talk about that.
Can I make a proposal, Chair? So those sessions today were excellent, but I think we need to get the Committee for the Administration, CAJ.
Yes.
Simply because they've done a lot of work on equality screening and things like that.
Yeah.
And I think if there is to be a reinvigoration of the equality screening in Section 75, then they may have something to share that process to help us in our strategic planning. Thank you.
Go ahead, Patrick.
Just on that, it's just to add to what Carol said as well. I'm conscious, and we actually had the same discussion this morning in the Economy Committee. All of what we've heard so far has been really, really useful, and it's helped us to understand better the landscape and where things are at. But it's all policy. And I think that one of the things that I always find in committees is it's very difficult for us to hear from individuals. Yeah. It's very difficult for us to get those practical realities. So one of the things that I think would actually enhance what we've heard today is actually to get people who are being discriminated against, who face those challenges each and every day, and the committee to hear that, because we have such a good understanding now in the back of those two really useful presentations. But I actually think we need to go a step beyond that and actually have the people who are facing the front line and understand the impact of that. Yeah. I think that would enhance our understanding as a committee as well. So if all our members are...
Yes. Yeah. And even if we invite them and they're a little bit sceptical, we could even do it in closed session. You know, if people are talking about their personal circumstances, but I do think that we need to hear that.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So thank you, Patrick.
And see, even just on that, Paul, as well, I mean, like we're doing a session now, just to keep talking about the Economy Committee in here, but we're doing a session in Foyle as well, because one of the big focuses is on regional balance. I don't think that it necessitates people coming to Stormont,
Yes.
because I think that is a barrier for a lot of people as well.
Mhm.
So I nearly think that we should be going out and actually having these conversations in spaces where everybody's more comfortable and we can have, so just if that makes things easier.
Well, absolutely, and I've seen the draft agenda for next week's strategy, and I think point 7 or 8 on it is definitely around our
Okay.
outreach session, so it's on there. But I think the other point of that is, we've got the technology now, so people should
Absolutely,
be able
yeah.
to come
Yeah.
in hybridly,
Absolutely.
if that's such a word. So, members, say strategy next week. So, any thoughts or any ideas? Certainly, we'll appreciate those next week. So, I'm just going to move on actually just to the draft forward work programme, and it's found at page 125 of the meeting pack. Just seek your agreement there and to proceed on that basis. Okay, members, at page 134, there's a list of proposed organisations to invite to a meeting on refugees on the 1st of May. Sorry, wait on. Let me just check that myself. So,
135.
yeah. Oh yes, sorry. I've just got that there.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, it's the one before that.
Okay, apologies, guys. Okay, sorry, I've got it. So who we're proposing for the 1st of May's briefing is Red Cross, Brighton Intercultural, Belfast City of Sanctuary, Northwest Migrants Forum and Annika Women's Collective, and I think we've sort of talked maybe about Asconi as well. It's quite a lot there, but we could maybe divide it up, but are people content with that?
Yeah.
Okay, and then where am I now? Think.
It's the next page.
Okay, so then correspondence then. So
There was just the ones to invite for ending violence against women and girls.
Okay, so the session on ending violence against women and girls, which is scheduled for the 15th of May, we've got Women's Aid Federation, Rape Crisis Centre, Nexus, Women's Resource and Development Agencies, and the Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network. You content with that?
No, I'm not. I do think that you need to have a bit of regional balance. Most of these are Belfast-centric organisations, and they're different kind of issues in relation to.
I agree. I mean, see, to be honest, I would actually like to hear from women who work in women's centres rather than policy development officers and big NGOs.
Okay.
To be frank.
Yeah.
Honestly, I mean, I'm not saying take that one off and put this one in. I'm just saying this stuff is actually going to a level where I don't know how many other than Women's Aid, but working with women every single day.
That's okay.
So I agree with Sinead. Apart from the regional imbalance stuff, I don't think it's reflective.
Okay.
Totally reflective.
Okay. Glad we raised it then. So
100%.
We'll look at that. We'll look at that.
We do have near one there for the rural women, but
okay.
But yeah.
We'll come back. We'll come back.
Yeah.
But again, there's individual rural organisations. I mean, that's an umbrella body, but they represent rural women very, very well. And every single one of these organisations do tremendous work.
Absolutely.
No, appreciate the point. Appreciate the point that you're making. Okay. So I'll speak to the clerk and we'll look at that again. Okay. So correspondence found on page 137 of your pack. And page 149, there's correspondence from Claire Hanna MP asking the committee to conduct an inquiry into funding for the Victims and Survivors Service. I suppose we could pick that up at the strategic planning session if that's okay. There was one point that I wanted to raise, members, and that was the letter from Phoenix Law around clerical childhood abuse, and I suppose it picks up a little bit on what I raised with the TO official. I think it was maybe the first or second session. That was about how long they've been talking about the research and the investigation into the extent to which there was clerical childhood abuse. And so I would very much concur with what the content of that letter was. We have got a session on mother and baby homes, and I'm just wondering if there's any way we can maybe incorporate some of this into that, because it reflects the work of the interdepartmental working group that was looking at both. Are you going to? Do you like to?
No, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also thinking of. I mean, they seem to represent most of the victims.
Yes.
So I think they are fairly representative.
Yes. Yeah.
But it would be good to hear, because sorry, the other thing I meant to ask, that we did agree to try and get the interim or the independent.
Yes, that's that mother and baby homes session,
So
so to
that's,
speak.
that's there,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it would be good to find out. I mean, it was good news about the two institutions the other day, but that's...
Yes. Again, I think that a lot of this should be moving at a similar pace.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so, was there anything else in the correspondence people would like to
just
raise?
the 2 points from last week that we skipped over just earlier in the meeting. One was a letter from reply from First Minister and Deputy First Minister on common frameworks. It's whether the committee would like to write to the department to ask for a list of the common frameworks that are outstanding, because it was quite a brief letter, and whether the committee wants to write to the other statutory committees to ask what common frameworks they're expecting. And the other one was a letter from Colin Harvey asking about the panel of experts that was supposed to be appointed for the ad hoc committee on the Bill of Rights. He was asking if it was still to be appointed, so it's whether the committee wanted to write to the department to ask that question.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Thank you, Claire. Okay, members, anything else in the correspondence? No. Okay, members, that's the end of the meeting then, so we'll be back in this room next Wednesday at 2 p.m.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, see if there's things that are carried over, can you put them into the version?
Committee Room 30, sound. Committee Room 30, sound.